It's me, Egbert, once again. I'm the new owner of this station. I went out and hired the best talk radio consultant, Jeff Allen from News Talk STL, and told him to hire the worst talent he could find. Jeff did exactly as I told him. Ladies and gentlemen, here are Brad and John.
Ancient Chinese secret.
And the ancient Chinese secret is that was 95% operator error. I will admit to that. I'm sorry that I made the mistake. Okay, it is time to go to our guest. Now, John, give me the intro here before we go to, how long have you known Gregg for?
Oh, man, I think I met Gregg in 2001, maybe 2002. His first campaign was for Jim Talent for U.S. Senate when Jim Talent defeated Gene Carnahan in that election. He went on to very quickly ascended to work for Bush Cheney in 2004, which is really where he gained even more statewide experience and has been a top Republican consultant since then.
So he's a heavyweight.
Absolutely.
Okay, here we go. Going to place the call right now. Gregg Keller. And going to talk to him about amendment number 2.
Hey, Brad, how are you?
Hey, Greg, good morning. Now, we had Brooke on here, who you probably know, who was against Amendment 2, and she brought up some interesting points. And let me address a couple things. Channel 5 here in St. Louis, and you're probably aware of this, has come out and said that you guys are touting that there's going to be all this money for education. Channel 5 says there's going to be no money for education or very little. Can you address that?
Yeah, so first of all, this will write it into the Missouri Constitution that this money is supposed to be used for educational purposes only for education, that it will go directly into the foundation formula that funds education in our state. Now, I will concede that in some instances in the past, what has happened is this money, education-related money, through proposals such as ours, have been diverted by politicians in Jefferson City. Now, this, again, specifically requires that this money will be used for education. If and when Amendment 2 passes, that money will be used for education, period. Full stop. However, what we also need to do is make sure that we hold the politicians' feet to the fire and make sure that they don't go ahead and just account for that, call it $100 million a year, that they go ahead and put that towards education, because it has to go towards education. What they could do is they could go ahead and they could basically backdoor take another $100 million and find it for new funding purposes. That is possible. But I would argue, and we would argue, that it's kind of the responsibility of the people in Jefferson City to not do that shell game. And if they do, we need to hold them accountable. So in other words, the money for Amendment 2 will absolutely go towards education funding.
So in other words, what people have accused the legislatures of saying, if money comes in from, like, let's say the lottery or something like that, hey, it's going to bring in $100 million. What they do is they take $100 million out of the education budget. So essentially, it just becomes like a zero-sum game kind of deal, right?
Exactly right. But the important thing about Amendment 2 is that it specifically writes it into the Constitution that this money has to be used for educational purposes, for education only. And that'll be in the Constitution. This money will be used for education purposes only. The other point that I would make, too, is currently we have all of this money going over to Kansas, going sports betting money going into Kansas, going into Illinois, because, of course, every single weekend we have people driving over into Kansas, Missourians driving over into Illinois to do their sports betting. That money is going to literally corrupt Chicago politicians to a large degree. Amendment 2 would make sure that whether or not you believe this is going to lead to an increase in education spending in Missouri, which we believe that it will, and it writes it into the Constitution that it will. But even if you think that some of that money is going to be diverted by Jefferson City politicians, the other thing that's also true is that at least Amendment 2 keeps that money in the state of Missouri. So whether it goes towards education, which we believe that it will, or it goes towards another program here in Missouri, at least that money is going to stay in the state of Missouri. It's not going to go to corrupt politicians in Chicago, which is the current case.
Now, let me ask you this, because if you go back in sports history, there was a time, and matter of fact, I just had the discussion with somebody, and John and I talked about this in the air. There was this point in time when Las Vegas wanted professional sporting teams, but they didn't, but none of the leagues, the NHL, MLB, NFL, didn't want anything to do with Vegas because they didn't want any connection whatsoever with sports and gambling. Now, in your ads, you've got, where you say in your ads, all the sports teams are behind this. What happened? Why did the sports teams go from not wanting to touch gambling with a 10-foot pole to endorsing gambling?
Yeah, Brad, it's funny that you ask. I was actually at Wrigley Field this last baseball season, went to a Cubs game to root against them, and walked out after the game was over, walked out of Wrigley Field. And you know the first thing you see when you're at Wrigley, when you leave the stadium, you see a huge sportsbook betting operation. It is owned by the Chicago Cubs. They are making tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars off of that every single year. And I think it points to an important fact that we need to take into consideration here, which is that the Chicago Cubs are making tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars off of sports betting on a sports book that their own franchise owns. St. Louis Cardinals have no such opportunity to do so. So what are the Cubs doing with that money? They're investing in players. They're investing in better facilities. They're investing in larger contracts for people. So we are literally putting our franchises, the Royals, the Cardinals, we're putting them at a competitive disadvantage versus these other versus our competitors because we don't have sports betting. It's another reason we need to do it, and it's exactly why why they want to have this and why they're more than happy to partner with the sports betting industry.
But are they getting money from this? See, this is the question I keep asking, and I can't ever get an answer. Are the Cardinals somehow, and the Royals and the Chiefs, are they making money off of this? If Amendment 2 passes, next week, are they in line to get a paycheck out of this?
Each of the existing Missouri major sports franchises would be given a sports book. So the opportunity to manage and oversee and make money off of an in-person sports betting location. So if you're at Busch Stadium, for instance, there is obviously, what do we call it? Cardinal Village, the Sports Live location there, right across from the stadium. That would become, among other things, a sports betting location where the Cardinals currently own, where you would be able to sports bet just like you do in 38 current states in the United States. Cardinals would own it, and yes, the Cardinals would make a tremendous amount of money off of it, which would be a huge shot in the arm to the franchise in terms of having more money to pay players.
So I have to be honest with you. I guess what bothers me a little bit about this is I hear what you're saying is it sounds like the Cardinals are like down to their last dollar and they don't have any money, and they're even talking about, I kid on the air about this, and I kid on social media about the fact that there was a thing that came out 3 or 4 months ago. The Cardinals are saying, our stadium's in bad shape. We need taxpayers to help us out. Mm-hmm. Aren't they making a boatload of money already with the team?
I think so. Totally separate issue. I think that the Cardinals ownership have made a lot of money off of this team. As I recall, they bought the thing in the they bought it in the mid to late 90s for, what was it, Brad? I think they bought it for like $120 million, which included $30 million worth of parking facilities that they immediately sold. Then you go ahead and you look at how much the club is worth today. It's worth like $2.5 billion. So I would, of course, these guys are making money. I mean, they're billionaires. Billionaires make money. At the same time, we are not blessed with the kind of ownership in St. Louis of the Cardinals that a lot of other cities have, which is multi-billionaire owners. I mean, you look at New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, other major cities. They have sports owners who are worth 10, 15, 20 billion dollars. That's not the situation in which we have St. Louis. Are these guys rich? Of course they are. They own a sports franchise. but are they making so much money off of it that they can buy those huge contracts, buy those prestige players? No, they're not. And this could help close the gap a little bit.
I got you. Okay, now this is, I've heard for the grapevine that this is pretty much of a slam dunk, that this is going to pass. I mean, what are your polling saying? I mean, to the point where I've heard people say it's going to pass by a margin of 60 to 65%. Is that go along with what you guys know?
I think it's going to be closer than that. I think you have a whole ton of, obviously it's a presidential year. You have all kinds of politicians, all kinds of political races that are on the ballot. You have Amendment 3. There's a whole bunch of noise, on the ballot. We feel pretty good about where we are. You don't want to take anything for granted. I think it's going to be close, but I think we're going to win this thing.
Got it. Now, one question, back up just a minute. When you say they're going to put a sports book across from the stadium in Ballpark Village, that will mean that you can bet on any sport, not just as necessarily the Cardinals, correct?
Correct. It'll be like if you go to Vegas. If you're in Vegas and you find yourself at a sports book at one of the major casinos, it'll be very similar to that. You have an opportunity to bet on all kinds of things. You'll have food. You'll have all kinds of entertainment. There will be plenty to do there. But yeah, you can bet on just about anything. It's amazing. I mean, particularly when you go on these betting websites, and I'm not a huge bettor, but you can bet on just about anything under the sun. So yeah, you'll have all kinds of opportunities to bet on various things.
John and I talked about this yesterday with the various thing. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Robinhood's running. You're familiar with Robinhood, the app that made the meme bets with what is it, the Cost headphones, and the other one was GameStop. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, they've got a thing where they're selling options for the president now, or some kind of a deal like that. And John and I talked about this yesterday. We find it fascinating that that all these prop bets and things like that exist. Hey, Greg, I appreciate your time this morning. You've answered the questions, and you gave me the answer that I couldn't get from anybody else, which is very interesting. And I do appreciate that your candor. And best of luck to you and your guys, because it's hard to believe that all this mayhem that's been going on, listen on the presidential level, will be over, at least we hope so, in 6 days, right?
Yep, we're almost there. Less than a week to go. Good luck.
Greg, appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yep, take care.
John, there's my answer. They're going
There's
to
your answer. Now, I didn't know that before we had Greg on the air. I had no idea that sport teams would be able to get a sports book out of it. That's a great piece of information.
And once again, I mean, remember we asked Brooke that, and she didn't know. I've asked people off the air, okay, explain to me why the sports teams wouldn't. I mean, and once again, go back to the Pete Rose thing. They didn't want to touch Pete Rose with a 10-foot borrowed pole because they did not want to have any connection between baseball and betting. Now, what he's saying is, you walk across the street, whatever street that is, I can't remember what street that is between the stadium and ballpark. I used to know. Is that Carr Street? I think it might be Carr Street. You walk across the street to a ballpark village, and one of those restaurants will be gone. It'll be a sports book. I'm going like, man. But now here can I give you my, and I don't want to beat up Greg on this, but here's my complaint about what he's talked about. He said you walk out of Wrigley Stadium and there's sports betting right across the street, okay? Why is it that we're on the third Busch Stadium here in St. Louis, but yet the Cubs are still playing in the original Wrigley Field, which is what, 80, 90 years old, 100 years old?
Yeah, it's certainly that old. And that's a great question. Now, I will say, if you've been, it's been a few years since I've been to Wrigley, but I would say that stadium could use some upgrades. Your point is not lost on me, though.
Well,
you could say the same thing about Fenway Park as well.
Exactly. And see, this is the thing that, remember, I've been finding these crazy pictures. I put them on my Facebook page. I don't know if you're a Facebook of I know you don't do much on Facebook, but I see these pictures of Busch Stadium number 2. And to me, it was such a beautiful stadium. It was symmetrical. The part of it is, if you took a picture of Busch Stadium to this day, and you took an aerial shot of Busch Stadium and said, what stadium is that? People go, that's Anheuser, that's Busch Stadium. But if you took an aerial shot of the Cardinals Stadium, the current Cardinals Stadium, and said, hey, what stadium is that? People are, is that Coors Field? No, hold it. Because it doesn't have any any noticeable, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't.
Character.
It doesn't have a signature look to it. Because remember the whole one of the whole downsides was, oh, we don't want to have a cookie cutter stadium because what was it? Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati was a round stadium, but yet the crazy.
And also let me interrupt real quick though. Busch Stadium from above did look a lot like Riverfront. It did look a lot like Three Rivers in Pittsburgh. But your point, I get your point about the fact that Busch Stadium doesn't look particularly unique.
Well, it looks like it was built by three different architectural firms who didn't talk to each other. You know what I mean? I mean, to me, it once again, it's sort of that old-timey look. And if you know about like the old stadiums, a lot of them were built where, they had the grandstands on the left and, the first base and the third base side. And then they put in some outfield bleachers. And then so it wasn't built at one time. It was added on and added on and added on. Here, I'm pulling up right now. Wrigley Field, 1914. It first opened in 1914 as Weegham Park for Charles Weegham's Chicago Whales of the Federal League, the Chicago Whales, which folded after the 1915 baseball season. It's 110 years old in the course of baseball. As a matter of fact, I heard this fascinating thing of all places on one of my ex-employees, Sue Thomas, who does a show now. She does a St. Louis a history show, and they had this guy on. I don't know if it was this past week. They run the show like on Saturday and Sunday morning, and this guy was a St. Louis Browns fan. And fascinating story.
Was it Bill Borst?
I don't think it was. I'll contact Sue and find out who the guy was. Do you know the Nancy Pelosi connection to why the St. Louis Browns left St. Louis?
No, I don't. What happened?
Do you know who the mayor of Baltimore was at the time when the Browns were looking to possibly relocate?
Paul Pelosi.
Nancy Pelosi's father.
You're kidding me.
No, Nancy Pelosi's father essentially lobbied for the fact that Baltimore needed a baseball team. And at the time, and the interesting part of it was, at the time, the dominant team in St. Louis was the St. Louis Browns. They had more money, and they owned the stadium. They owned, at the time, it was Sportsman's Field. They owned the stadium. The Browns owned it, and the Cardinals were not doing well. This goes back to, late 40s, early 50s. And the Cardinals were not doing well, and the Cardinals were possibly going to look to relocate out of St. Louis until Augie Busch came along and bought the Cardinals. And at that point in time, he also bought the stadium. And at that point in time, the ownership of the Browns thought to themselves, okay, we could compete when we were up against, Joe Average owner. But now that the Busch family, at the time, the Busch brewery was really on the rise back in the 50s and the 60s. Once the Busch family bought the Cardinals, the Browns essentially said, okay, we're done here in St. Louis. And Nancy Pelosi's father, lobbied the Browns to bring the Browns to Baltimore, who are today the Baltimore Orioles. Is that interesting little tidbit of history?
That is a great piece of information. And I happen to know a little bit about the St. Louis Browns, and I had no idea that connection. Brad.
Yeah, I didn't either. I've never heard that before. And I never heard the fact.
What the Browns should have done, they should have gone into Mr. Pelosi's house with a hammer.
That's not funny.
And said, we want our team back.
That dude just got life in prison. Did you hear that?
The attack itself is not funny.
Oh, and it was so bizarre because, the whole crazy thing was, and if you know the whole story, he didn't start beating on Pelosi's husband until the cops showed up. And the cops were like, and I'm going like, okay, once again, I will say it till the day I die. There are bad cops. Not many of them, a handful of them. Most of the cops are great people who literally put their lives on the line every day. How would you like to be the police officer responding to that call, and you see this bizarre situation? You walk into a house, and there's a guy standing there with who they don't know, but they do know it's Nancy Pelosi's husband. And all of a sudden, the guy whips out his hammer and starts beating on Pelosi's husband. I know.
If I was in San Francisco and that happened, I would ask to go back on the street that just did sidewalk defecation.
Listen to you, John.
I'd want to go back to the sidewalk defecation beat.
I don't think there is such a beat in San Francisco, from what I heard, because nobody ever gets arrested for that. Okay, we have to take a break.
Thanks for checking out the Brad and John Show podcast. This segment of the show is brought to you by John Combest's book, Stalking, Harassment, Internet Trolling, A Guide to Recovering and Rebuilding After Online Attacks. It's a great reference if you've ever been the unfortunate target of a social media attack. It's available on Amazon. Just search John Combest. That's Combest, John Combest, and the book will show up in your search results. Now it's time for another segment of the Brad and John Show. Can you handle it?